Okay, now please notice, it doesn't say Solomon sat on the throne of Israel, sat on his throne. Everybody's sitting on David's throne. Remember, he's the establishment king, and he's the one that everyone is compared to. And then in verse 45, it says that King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before Jehovah forever. So this is, again, a fulfillment of the promise to David that his throne would last forever. Then in 1 Kings 3, 1 through 3, Solomon made affinity with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had made an end of building his own house and the house of Jehovah and the wall of Jerusalem. Only the people sacrificed in the high places because there was no house built for the name of Jehovah until those days. And Solomon loved Jehovah, walking in the statutes of David his father. So he starts off well. And sadly, like so many people in the Bible, he doesn't end well. Doesn't seem to be able to handle all the power and the glory and the blessing. And then in 1 Kings 10, 23 and 24, the text says, and O Jehovah, the God of Israel, that's not where I want. 1 Kings, that's 8. Excuse me. 1 Kings 10, 23 and 24. So Jehovah exceeded all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. That's, of course, would include the king of Egypt, the king of Babylon, all these other kings. We finally got a time where the king of Israel is the number one king. It's the only time in all of Israelite history where they are the world superpower. And all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. So this deals with the golden age of Israel. Now, before we talk about the amazing things about the King of Solomon and the amazing blessings that God gave him, I want us to keep in mind a conversation that Jesus has with the Pharisees of his day. And what does he say about himself in connection with King Solomon? Anybody know? Well, that is a reference to Solomon and about the birds and all that. But he says basically, behold, a greater than Solomon is here, referring to himself. Now, that's really saying something. Dr. Robert G. Lee made this statement in his commentary. He says, the Pharisees must have wondered at Jesus' bold statement that he was greater than Solomon. After all, Jesus was a carpenter's son. Solomon was born in a palace. Jesus was born in a stable. Solomon was born in Jerusalem. Jesus was born in little Bethlehem. Solomon had many servants to wait upon him hand and foot. Jesus had none. Solomon wore his kingly robes. Jesus wore his peasant's garb. Solomon drank from vessels of gold. Jesus had to get a drink from a Samaritan harlot. Solomon was rich beyond compare, while Jesus was a mere pauper. Solomon had great armies, but Jesus had only a few stragglers following him. Solomon lived in mansions. Jesus was homeless and sometimes didn't have a place to lay his head. Solomon had thousands of horses and chariots and rode in splendor. Jesus walked. How could Jesus be greater than Solomon? So that's the thought question that I want you all to be thinking about. And that, I think, is going to be the thought question that I want to give the kids in VBS, and that I want folks to think about when we look to not just these good kings, but to Jesus as the King of Kings. And it is an amazing contrast, and worthy of a lot of, I think, profound thought. Now, this is a special period of Israelite history. Every major civilization has what we might refer to as their golden age. For example, the Greek civilization. What would be the golden age of the Greeks? How about Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Alexander the Great, who went out and spread Hellenism and conquered the known world. That was definitely their golden age. And then the Roman Empire. Eventually, of course, they crumbled, but in their heyday, that was thought to have been the days of the noble Roman Republic and probably the first 100 years of the early Roman Empire. Then you have the Phoenicians, a state that in the 8th century ruled the world because of their naval power. Kind of reminds me of the British Empire, that little island that had such influence because of their navy. And they established a colony known as Carthage that later on in the Punic Wars challenged Rome itself for control of the Mediterranean. So the Phoenicians, actually considered to be the ones who invented the alphabet that we use. And a lot of math comes from the Phoenicians. That was their golden age. And now we have the Hebrews, the latter reign of David, and the fact that David messed up, but he ends in a right relationship with God. And so he is the standard bearer of faithfulness. And probably 3/4 through the reign of King Solomon, he is going to do Jehovah proud. I mean, he's really going to do some amazing things, and it says he loved Jehovah, and Jehovah loved him. Now, during this period of David and Solomon, why is this considered the golden age of Israelite history? Well, this was the only real period of political unification. The North and South are united and they are working together. And this is a time of peace. Remember, Solomon's name means what? Peace. He's the Prince of Peace. Shalom, Solomon. So there's peace and prosperity and political unification. And though they had been given the land and could have gone and possessed it if they'd followed God's will in the period of Joshua, this is the only period where they controlled all the land of promise, from the Wadi al-Aris, the river of Egypt, all the way up to the Euphrates. And when you control all of that real estate, about 60,000 square miles, you control all those trade routes that go through there. And that is going to be the source of much of Israel's wealth. So this is the greatest period of material prosperity by far. And it says, every man sat underneath his fig tree and was, fanned by the palm fronds. This is a time of literature writing and leisure time and prosperity. And the money just rolled in from all of those trade routes and all the tariffs they charged. And this was the period of greatest spiritual strength, not perfection by far. In fact, it even mentions that they should have been worshiping at the tabernacle before the temple was built during the early reign of Solomon, but instead they worshiped Jehovah in the high places. So they were worshiping Jehovah. They weren't bowing down to idols, but they were worshiping him in some unauthorized ways. But overall, this is going to be a period of spiritual strength, and so it will be a period of their greatest blessing. So, where does this wisdom from Solomon come from, and where does it begin? Yeah, it's an answered prayer. All of these blessings start with a selfless prayer. And let's remember James 1. The key to success in life is, the choices we make. It's not knowledge, but the application of knowledge. What does James 1 tell us we can receive if we just ask for it? Wisdom. Not the wisdom of Solomon. His wisdom was especially unique. But I love this account, how he's humble as a young man. And in 1 Kings 3, God appears to him in a dream. And he actually says, okay, I'm going to set you over the throne, and I'm going to give you whatever your heart desires, one wish. Wouldn't that be something? you ever thought about if God came to you and said, I'm going to give you one wish? Now, you can't say, I wish for 10 more wishes. And so, what does he ask for? He asks for wisdom. He says, give thy servant, verse 9, an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this thy great people? And the speech pleased the Lord. God's not used to people being so selfless and being concerned about others. And verse 11, and God said unto him, because thou hast asked this thing, and hast not asked for a long life, neither hast thou asked for riches for thyself, nor asked for the life of thine enemies, but hast asked for thyself understanding in order to discern justice. Excuse me. Behold, I have done according to thy word. I have given thee a wise and understanding heart, so that there hath not been like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise likened unto thee. So you're going to be one of a kind. You're going to be unique. And I have also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. So you're going to be the greatest king in your day. And Jesus tells the Pharisees, I'm greater than Solomon. You can see why that must have amazed them. And in many ways, it should amaze us, because Solomon was pretty great. Now, so first, it's a selfless prayer. And God says, okay, you got it. Then it is illustrated through the woman and her baby, or maybe I should say the two women and the two babies. And this is a famous story, and I think it really is special. He's on his throne. You get the impression that this is one of the early cases that he has to try to discern as a king. And there's two women, one baby, and no witnesses. It's a he shed, she shed. How in the world are you going to tell this live baby, one is dead, the other is live, they're both claiming the live baby belongs to them? How's he going to figure out who's telling the truth? So he does something that's pretty clever, knowing human nature, and maybe I should say maternal instincts. And all the crowds watch this and pay attention. And they're wondering, what's Solomon going to do? How can you tell who's this baby belong to? And so he shocks everyone, and he says, grab a sword, and we'll just take the baby and cut it in half. And that way they both can have the baby half and half. Of course, crazy thing to do. Everybody gasp. And what does Solomon know is going to happen? The real mother is going to say, no. Don't kill the baby. She can have it. And the other woman who's lying says, no, that's good enough. If I can't have it, we'll just split it. And so Solomon says, give her the baby, because the one who's willing to give up the baby is the real mother. And everybody goes, that was perceptive. And so the saying goes throughout all Israel about the wisdom that Solomon showed. And apparently, this was just an example of the typical kind of wise and discerning judgments that Solomon made during his reign that illustrated his wisdom. All right? Now, how is this like truth? I've heard some preachers wax eloquent about this, and that is that truth is somewhat like this baby in this account. What do we have to have when it comes to truth? All of it or some of it? When you stand before a judge in a court, you're supposed to put your hand on the Bible and say, I swear to tell what? Yeah, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God. If you devoid the baby, obviously you destroy it. And if you devoid truth, divide it, cut it in half, pick and choose only what you want, you destroy it as well. So, another illustration of Solomon's great wisdom is that this is spread throughout the realm. And so this is giving glory to God, because Solomon was giving glory to God. And it's the visit of the Queen of Sheba in 1 Kings 10, 1 through 9. This was an African country of that time, probably around Ethiopia. And the queen basically says, I have heard so many people talk about how wise you are and how wealthy you are, and I can't be that great. So I'm going to come and see for myself. So she asked if she can make sort of a head of state visit to another head of state with all her wealth and her people that she brings with her. And what's the famous statement that she makes after she asks Solomon these hard questions and she gets these amazing answers and she surveys his throne room and looks at all of his wealth and all of his servants and how happy all of his servants are and how blessed everyone is and how blessed is the God of Jehovah. And her comment that is so famous is what? She says, the half hath not yet been told, right? And so she makes the comment that not only were people not exaggerating, but they hadn't told me half of how great it is. Have you ever had the experience of everybody brags about some new movie that's come out? Oh, you got to see this movie. It's just the greatest thing. So everybody's talking about it. And so you go, okay. And then you come out after everybody's got your expectations jacked real high and you go, I was underwhelmed. Wasn't that great? I mean, that tends to be what happens sometimes when people go on and on about something and then you see it, you're disappointed. She wasn't disappointed at all. The exact opposite. And so this God-given wisdom in the text is illustrated by one of his judgments and by one of the comments of a foreign dignitary. And Jesus tells his disciples that the Queen of Sheba is going to rise up in judgment against you because what you've seen is even greater than what she saw. And she saw the greatness of Solomon, and yet you have missed the new Solomon and the greatness that I represent. I mean, Solomon had a lot of wisdom, and he was a pretty cool, powerful dude. He couldn't perform miracles. He may have controlled the waters of the day with his navy, but he couldn't walk on water, right? I mean, Jesus is here to give us eternal life and eternal joy. Solomon's going to come and go, but Jesus is here now, and he's somebody we can depend upon. And so he truly is greater than Solomon and has greater wisdom. In fact, he's the key to all wisdom and knowledge, according to Colossians chapter 3. So as we look at how great Solomon was and all these statements about his wisdom and his wealth, keep in mind that this is all kind of a foreshadowing of Jesus. This is also demonstrated by his writings. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 4, 29 and following. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 29 and also verse 32. Someone like to read verse 29 and verse 32 for us? Okay, go ahead. Les?
God gave wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Want to continue?
And then verse 32.
32. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005.
Yeah, that's good. So, just a little point here. The wisdom literature focus on the wisest man that ever lived. Doesn't that make sense? One of my favorite parts of the Bible are Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those are some amazing books. And we're told that he wrote 3,000 proverbs. How many of his proverbs are preserved for posterity? Only about 900. Wonder what happened to the others? I don't know. But the 900 that were preserved must be mighty special and really worth our taking the time to learn from the wisest man that ever lived. And his songs were 1,005. How many songs do we have preserved for us? One out of 1,005 that were written. This is the Song of Songs. And so we tend to avoid this. But man, this must be mighty special for that one to be preserved for us. Remember, Proverbs is about practical wisdom. And what does he say in Proverbs 1 and verse 7? What is the beginning of wisdom? Fear. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? And one of the reasons our world is in such a mess is so many people aren't taught about the Bible and aren't taught about the Lord. Instead, they're taught Darwinian evolution, that we're just some sort of sophisticated amoeba, some advanced primate that came about by accident, by a bunch of molecules just happening to colliding into each other without any purpose or dignity at all, except the survival of the fittest. Does that give you some sense of you really being special and important and have a life worth living? Not at all. Proverbs says the beginning of wisdom is the fear and the knowledge of the Lord. Eleanor Roosevelt said this: learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all yourself. That's also attributed to Mark Twain. But that's good wisdom, isn't it? And why do we find so many stories of the details of how people mess up? Hopefully, so they can be object lessons for us, so we don't have to do that. And one of the most important books is the book of Ecclesiastes, which basically answers the question of what is life? I've only got so many days to live. How should I live? How should I focus my efforts? What paths should I go down? And the devil wants us to seek power and wealth and pleasure and all these short-sighted things instead of trust in the Lord with all your heart, in all other ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. And he says, the beginning of all things is the fear of the Lord, and the end of all things, the end of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commandments. For that's what really gives meaning in life, and will set you up for the next one as well. And we learn this from the wisest man that ever lived. And as we said, he talks about true love. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If anyone were to exchange anything for love, he will be utterly despised. In other words, a life just based upon materialism is empty, and where you get meaning in life is your relationships. And interestingly enough, if I understand Song of Solomon correctly, it's basically exalting one man, one woman. And it's actually against polygamy from one of the most polygamous men that ever lived, Solomon. So he's saying, yeah, I had all these women. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But that's not the best way to understand true love. It's monogamy, not polygamy. So Solomon's wisdom is clear. And the greatest irony of all, and so sad, is God gives Solomon all this wisdom, and he dies a fool. Doesn't follow his own advice. See, though he was wise, God didn't take away his free moral agency. God didn't turn him into a robot. God just blessed him perhaps above anything that we could think or imagine as far as wealth and pleasure. He says, whatsoever my eyes desired, I kept not from them. And he had the power and the wealth to have whatever he wanted, to purchase whatever he wanted, to have any woman that he wanted. I mean, he had supposedly everything. And he looks at the end and he says, it's all empty without God. And yet what happens is people think, well, I'm going to be different. I'm going to be unique. I watched a interview where this guy was interviewing this billionaire. And he said, you're still looking for more. You're still thinking about what you can do to reinvest and compound your money and avoid taxes. And he goes, how much is enough? And you know what he said? He said, just a little more. And that's pretty much the way it is. Unless you believe by faith, that's not where I want to focus my life. The eye is not satisfied with the seeing, nor the ear with the hearing. That was said by a man who had everything. And he says, that's not where it's at. I can't tell. Chase, is that you up against that glaring light? Blinded by the light. Who I see? Chase Miller. Yes, sir.
You say he died as a fool, but then you were also mentioning he looks at all of his empty pleasures and say, yeah, he says, yes, this was useless.
Yes.
So what makes you say he did die a fool if he's looking at all of his empty pleasures and saying, yes, they're empty?
Well, because there's no indication when it talks about how he in the end, his heart was turned away from God and he started bowing down to idols. And, he never repented. If he would have repented, certainly we would have been told, because God tells him, because you won't repent, you're not going to have the extended life you could have had, and you're going to lose the kingdom. But I won't do it during your lifetime because of David, and I won't take away the whole kingdom from the family of David because of my promise to David. So it looks to me like we're not going to see Solomon in heaven. He had his little taste of heaven on the earth. And, I think the reason why he bows down to all these idols, it says to please his foreign wives who came from all these foreign places. And he couldn't tell these women no. And he wanted to please them. And they drew his heart away from God. And that's exactly what Moses said would happen if you marry foreign women. So he knew what he should have done, but he wasn't willing to do it. I'm assuming just because of his own pride.
It's so interesting that God looks at someone like Paul. Paul says, remove this thorn from my flesh. And he goes, you gotta keep the thorn so that you
remain humble.
So that you're not a jerk. And then Solomon, I don't know if the Lord sometimes chooses to look ahead and sometimes he doesn't. He just says, all right, here you go. And I wonder if that would have been the same ending for Solomon had he not.
I don't know. The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Somehow or other, you have to factor all that into free will. Because you can't have a love relationship, and this is all about God wanting a relationship with us, if it isn't done based upon free will. I mean, when you're dating, you ask the girl out, and you hope she says yes. And you might be persistent, as I was, and ask multiple times. But if you continue to ask and the girl says, no, I'm not interested, after a while, it's just harassment. And now you're a pest and get out of my face. And so God doesn't force himself. Jesus doesn't force himself on any of us. He knocks on the door and we have to choose to come in. Yes?
It seems more like a gift that it started off with kind of good intent to help others, like the mom, right?
Yeah.
And splitting the baby. And then it grew into something self-serving, wealth, concubines, and so and maybe that's a takeaway for us. If we have our gift, use the gift for God and not please yourself and for worldly things.
And don't ever think, I don't need God because I'm doing so well. The reason you're doing so well is because God's blessing you, but then you turn around and forget where your blessings come from. See,
Like Moses.
Yeah, like Moses. And all these women, they represented foreign alliances. And I think he got more comfortable with all these foreign alliances and all these treaties sealed by these marriages. I don't need God. Look at all these foreign alliances and look at all this wisdom I have in being political. How ironic. All he needed was his alliance with God. He didn't need any of these other things. And yet, one of the first things we're told he did once he got to the throne, even when he was, at the time loving Jehovah and Jehovah was loving him, is he marries Pharaoh's daughter. The first big ally you want to have is with the breadbasket of the world, with Egypt. But he started off with that, even built a special palace. You think the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, was pretty happy with Solomon? Yeah, and then if you don't do what she wants, then you mess up things with your dad back home. That was the way they sealed alliances back then. So don't think of these women as primarily just, he was some Hugh Hefner fella and it was all about sex. I think this was mostly about these foreign alliances and relying upon them rather than relying upon God. Go ahead, Les.
When I was reading chapter 3, verse 3, there's a word that jumped out at me, and I kept reading it. No matter how great he was, and God said he kept all his statutes, but there's that word in there, except. In our lives, we can do all that we want, but there's going to be something that's going to be, except we did this, or we like this, or whatever. We have to be careful that we don't have exceptions in our life.
Good. I think that would preach, brother. Yes, that is a wonderful point. Unless he's Lord of all, he's what? Not Lord at all. All right, so his wisdom, smarter than all the other wise men of his day. So it says in 1 Kings 4, 30-31 that he was wiser than all the kings, and then they list all the wise men of their day that we never heard of and don't know who they are, but back in his day, they were like it. And everybody recognized that he was the wisest of them all, which fulfills the promise of 1 Kings 3:12 when he was just a kid, just a teenager, and was asking for wisdom, that you're going to be mightier and wiser than everybody else. He's also known, this is often overlooked. I think this is so neat. Sometimes people refer to Solomon as the man of many PhDs. Let's look at 1 Kings 4, 33 and 34. It says, and he also spake of trees from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. So God gave him not just, discernment and wisdom, but, special knowledge. He was like an arborist, and he would talk about birds. He was an ornithologist, and he would talk about creeping things and insects and fishes. I looked this up this afternoon. He was an ichthyologist, a PhD in fishes and fishing, and an ornithologist, which is an expert in birds and an expert in animals, a zoologist. So you would come to the king not just for, what do I do about this kind of discernment questions, but he was kind of given these PhDs in all these different subjects, and he knew all these things about all these other things, insects and fishes and birds and how to have good agriculture and all that nobody else knew. So that was a part of what they were coming him for, scientific prowess. And then Solomon's wealth. I think this is pretty neat. This is what 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 5 says. And the king made silver and gold at Jerusalem as plenteous as stones. So you go outside and you pick out stones anywhere you find them, and he says silver and gold was that plentiful. And cedar was the ultimate plant from the cedars of Lebanon. And it was so plentiful that it was like finding sycamore trees, which were a dime a dozen. He says the cedar was like sycamore. They were so abundant. And then in 1 Kings 7:21, it basically says they had so much money in his day that they didn't even go after silver. Everything was gold. They didn't have silverware. They had goldware. Let me see here. That looks like that's the wrong chapter. Yeah, it's not 7:21. Let me see here. Oh, it's supposed to be 10:21. And all of King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver, for silver was counted as nothing in the days of Solomon. So they didn't have silverware, they had goldware. I think that's really cool. So the Queen of Sheba talks about how she was impressed not just with his wisdom, but with his royal bounty and all of his prosperity. Notice what it says about one day's provisions in 1 Kings 4. Now remember, you already have 700 wives and 300 concubines. How'd you like to take them out to lunch and foot the bill? How'd you like to take them out to dinner and foot the bill? And then all the different 500 people that worked underneath you as managers and all these different people that would show up. I mean, huge provision. 1 Kings 4:22. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour and 70 measures of meal and 10 fat oxen and 20 oxen out of the pastures and 100 sheep besides harts, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region and over all the kings, and he had peace on all sides. That's for one day. They'd have to go through all of that. And just for show, they had 300 solid gold 3-pound shields, according to 1 Kings 10 and verse 17. Now, I did a little math. If you just assume $1,900 per ounce and 16 ounces in a pound, 16 ounces times 1,900 is 30,400. And so he had $27,390,000 worth of decorative shields throughout the temple as you would walk in. Just unbelievable opulence. And the throne room, you can see a picture of it here, was amazing to behold. 1 Kings 10:18 through 20 talks about the throne room. And it is amazing. Verse 18, the king made a great throne of ivory, overlain it with the finest gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and the top of the throne was round behind. And there were stays on either side behind the place of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the stays. And 12 lions stood there on one side, and on the other 6 steps there was not a throne like it in any kingdom anywhere. And so you can get this picture here. If you approach the throne, just the majesty of all of these luxurious items. He had an impressive navy that enforced all of these tariffs. And I marvel with these discussions about his navy. By the way, this is unusual. Israel normally is not a seagoing people. Jerusalem is inland and all that. So this was very unusual. 1 Kings 9 and verse 26. Talks about all the 1,400 chariots that he had and 12,000 horsemen and chariot cities. All this reference to chariots. When we studied Judges, did the Jews ever have any chariots? No, they were scared to death. Everybody else had chariots. They didn't. But King Solomon talks about having, I think, 4,000 stables just to keep all of his chariots and all of his horses. And in chapter 10, verses 11, and the navy also of Hiram that brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir great plenty of almug trees and precious stones. And so they go on. And 926, and King Solomon made a navy of ships in Ezion Geber, which is to the south. So they control the Red Sea, and then they control the Mediterranean Sea, that area there. And it even says that they brought in apes and peacocks. So they're importing ivory and all these apes and peacocks. So you could come to see King Solomon, and he'd say, let me show you some of my private zoo animals. Amazing. Army and chariots and this huge harem. Yes?
There's a reference in too about his ships coming back every 3 years full of gold.
Yes, full of gold and full of apes and peacocks. So, and why do I have a huge harem underneath his wealth? He's got to support all these women. So it was a status symbol, but it was also a way to seal foreign alliances. As we mentioned, he lost his reliance upon God. Women became his downfall and drove his heart away. Pride corrupts, and the serious consequences are he's going to lose the kingdom. So I want you to continue to think about how is Jesus greater than Solomon, and how amazing that must have been to the people who knew their history about Solomon and how great he was. Yes, Pat.
In Deuteronomy 17, Moses is telling people to be king.
Yes.
He specifically says, get someone who will have horses and have wives. And he tells them why. And yet, Solomon has all those things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what he did. It all became about him and not the people. Because at the end, it says one of the reasons they're going to rebel is the high taxes. See? So history repeats itself over and over again, doesn't it? Pretty interesting. Okay, I hear the kids out. I didn't hear the bell, but thank you. We're going to look at the emergence of the North-South dichotomy and what happens with Jeroboam and the beginning of the divided kingdom. So thank you very much. And aren't you glad that we serve someone that's a king greater than Solomon?
I think we're going to have to extend the bell a little longer. Yeah, so you can hear that.
Yeah.
It's a joke.
Oh, I need to hear it, so whatever you have to do.
That was in reference to like where the bell kept on ringing. Kept
Oh.
on ringing, kept on ringing.
Oh, it wouldn't stop. That was last week, I think. Yeah.
How so? Jesus' kingdom is forever.
Yeah.
Solomon is just a few years.
Yes. Good point. There's a whole lot of different things